Every age has its wonders. Today we look at Machu Picchu, the Great Wall of China, or the statue of Christ above Rio as symbols of human triumph. But behind every modern marvel stands an older story, which will be for another time. This one belongs to the ancients. Each wonder arose from a different land, different faiths and ambitions, yet all shared the same restless need to make beauty endure, to be remembered after death, to leave proof that humans had touched the divine. The 7 wonders were not simply monuments. They were the first answers to mortality, the world's oldest link between dream and time. They rose before writing, before memory, before the very notion of history existed. From the deserts of Egypt to the valleys of Mesopotamia, humankind began to lift the earth toward the heavens, shaping mud and stone into prayers made permanent. To the people who built them, these first monuments were not symbols of vanity. They were acts of faith, declarations that mortal hands could touch eternity. Every block laid upon another was a rebellion against the frailty of flesh, a promise whispered to the gods that men too could create what time could not destroy. Before history was written, before the word wonder had ever been uttered, humankind began to shape the world with hands that sought permanence against time. Across river valleys and sun-blasted plains, the first cities rose like mirages turned to stone. They did not build simply to live, they built to endure. Every brick, every rising tier of earth and clay was a statement hurled against mortality. The gods demanded monuments, and men, discovering themselves capable of creating them, obliged. The first builders worked in mud. It was the substance of their rivers, their walls, and their myths, soft in the hand, hard beneath the sun. In Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates braided through desert, priests commanded laborers to heap clay upon clay, until temples pierced the haze of heat. These ziggurats, great mountain shrines, were the world's earliest steps toward heaven. They mirrored the mountains that framed the horizon, yet they were the work of men, not of gods. In their layered terraces, humanity took its first architectural breath. Each tier rose through measured toil. Ramps of packed earth sloped around the growing towers. Baskets of clay were carried upon bent backs. Songs marked rhythm to keep time with pain. Thousands labored beneath the gaze of priests who claimed divine instruction. To ascend a ziggurat was to climb toward the divine itself. Offerings of grain and incense filled its summit shrines, and at night the fire altars flickered like a constellation fallen to earth. This, perhaps, was the birth of the idea that building could defy death. What had begun as shelter became symbol. Kings learned to harness the power of stone and brick, not only to please their gods, but to proclaim dominion. The higher they built, the more eternal they imagined their rule. In the shadow of each completed tower, a new generation began to dream of surpassing it. The race toward magnificence had begun. While Mesopotamia lifted temples of clay, another civilization, born beside a slower river, shaped eternity from limestone. Egypt's Nile Valley, green ribbon through an ocean of gold, offered both bounty and order. When the river rose, fields flourished. When it fell, the people built. Floodwater provided not only sustenance, but rhythm, dividing the year between harvest and labor. From this cycle of life and toil emerged a culture obsessed with permanence. Early Egyptian kings built mastabas, flat-topped tombs of mud brick, simple in form yet vast in purpose. Beneath their solid walls slept rulers who believed that death was not an end, but a continuation. As dynasties multiplied, so did ambition. The architect Imhotep, serving Pharaoh Djoser, transformed the mastaba into something unprecedented. a staircase for the soul. His step pyramid at Saqqara rose layer upon layer, a petrified echo of the Mesopotamian ziggurat, but refined through Egyptian vision. Where the Sumerians reached upward to touch their gods, the Egyptians sought to ascend toward eternity itself. The leap from mud brick to limestone was more than technical. It was philosophical. Stone promised what flesh could not, survival beyond decay. Carved with copper chisels and levered into place by men working in perfect rhythm, each block became a syllable in a language of immortality. Engineering evolved with faith. The slope of each pyramid was calculated with the precision of priests who believed that geometry itself was sacred, a reflection of cosmic balance. Numbers guided their hands. The heavens guided their hearts. To organize such undertakings required a new kind of power. The kings of the Nile discovered how to marshal not only soldiers, but the very seasons. When the floods came, the peasants' fields disappeared under water. When they receded, the pharaoh's overseers summoned the idle population to labor on royal works. It was a system both pragmatic and divine. Men toiled not for wages, but for the afterlife promised by their king, whose tomb they were building. Labor became liturgy. Bronze tools bit deeper than stone. Copper chisels gave way to alloys that could carve granite from the quarries of Aswan. Sledges dragged these monoliths across desert flats slickened with water to reduce friction, and the air rang with the creak of rope and the chant of overseers. In such efforts, humanity discovered the mathematics of endurance. Angles, slopes, and weights were no longer mysteries, but instruments of ambition. Each innovation bred new possibility. The wheel, once used to spin pottery, now turned upon axles to haul stones. The lever became an arm of muscle multiplied. Simple machines, born of necessity, became extensions of human will. The ancients learned that imagination was a form of power. The same mind that measured the stars could measure a ramp's incline, or the force needed to lift a block that weighed more than 100 men. In these early centuries, architecture became theology written in stone. Temples aligned with solstices. Tombs pointed toward constellations believed to shelter the souls of kings. Builders watched the stars to fix their foundations, marrying heaven and earth through geometry. The great pyramids of later ages would perfect this celestial dialogue. Their sides aligned so precisely with the cardinal points that modern instruments can scarcely improve upon them. Beyond the monuments themselves lay the systems that made them possible. Pharaohs ruled through an intricate hierarchy of scribes, foremen, and labor gangs, each division accountable to the next. Records etched upon fragments of papyrus spoke of daily rations, bread, beer, onions, meticulously distributed to sustain the armies of builders. These were not slaves in the popular imagination, but conscripted peasants performing their sacred duty during the months when their fields lay under water. Their work was communal faith expressed through physical endurance. What drove such labor? Fear of death, reverence for kings, awe before the gods, all played their part. Yet beneath them pulsed something more human, the desire to leave a mark. Every chisel stroke whispered defiance against the oblivion that swallowed all things. As one era rose upon the ruins of another, this defiance became civilization's heartbeat. Meanwhile, far from the Nile and the twin rivers, the idea of monument spread like a rumor through time. In the Aegean islands, cyclopean walls of rough stone guarded citadels, where kings of myth ruled. In Crete, palaces unfolded in labyrinthine splendor, their columns painted red, their courts paved for rituals lost to memory. Across the plains of Anatolia, Hittite gates stood carved with lions, proclaiming sovereignty in the language of sculpture. Everywhere the impulse was the same: to make the invisible visible, to give faith and power tangible form. Bronze smelters in these lands discovered that the same fire which softened metal could transform architecture. Tools grew sharper, artistry more daring. Builders learned to set arches over doorways, distributing weight with mathematical grace. Columns grew taller, beams broader, until stone itself seemed to bend to human intention. Where once mud brick crumbled in the rain, now limestone and granite endured through centuries. In this slow evolution, from clay to cut stone, from mound to temple, the foundations of the seven wonders were laid. Not the monuments themselves, but the idea behind them. The concept that beauty and scale could declare greatness. That the measure of a civilization lay in the vastness of what it could build. The people of these early ages might not have called their works wonders, but they felt the same astonishment we do when confronted by greatness beyond comprehension. To stand before a ziggurat's shadow or the gleaming face of a pyramid was to glimpse the divine through human craft. Each structure spoke a universal truth, that mankind, though mortal, could shape eternity with its hands. By the time the first millennium approached, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires rose and fell along the same rivers where the first builders had sung to their gods. Yet the dream of permanence endured. Every palace, every temple, every towering statue built thereafter carried within its heart the same ancient impulse to make time pause, if only for a moment, before moving on. In the centuries that followed, this dream would find new forms: marble temples glowing in the sun, gardens suspended in air, lighthouses blazing across dark seas. The seven wonders were still far in the future, but their spirit was already alive, in the minds of those early builders who looked at clay and saw eternity. They had discovered the first secret of civilization, that imagination, once given stone, could outlive its makers. And from their dusty plains and riverbanks, a lineage of greatness began, one that would stretch from the ziggurat to the pyramid, from the stepped temple to the lighthouse's flame, binding all ages through the shared desire to build against death itself. At dawn, when the sun climbed over the eastern cliffs and struck the western sands, Egypt awoke to its own reflection, a civilization that believed stone could think and that death itself could be persuaded by geometry. Across the Giza plateau, men moved like the tide, hauling blocks that gleamed beneath the rising light. The air shivered with the rhythm of hammers and chants, and the desert, once a silence of wind and bone, became the workshop of eternity. The dream of immortality had taken form. Where earlier peoples had raised towers of clay, the Egyptians built mountains of stone. Each pyramid was a horizon turned solid, a dialogue between earth and sky, the mortal and the divine. Their kings did not merely wish to be remembered, they wished to live forever, to anchor their souls in monuments that even time would hesitate to erase. The idea had roots in the age of Djoser, whose step pyramid at Saqqara first reached for heaven in terraces of limestone. But it was Khufu, lord of the fourth dynasty, who turned that ancient experiment into perfection. When he ascended the throne around 2600 BC, Egypt was at peace, rich from harvest and trade, governed by a bureaucracy as precise as the calendar. From that wealth arose an ambition unlike any before it, to build a tomb so vast that it would rival creation itself. The place chosen was Giza, a plateau where the desert met the fertile valley, a borderland between the living and the dead. The foundation stone was laid upon bedrock, leveled by channels of water, the builders using simple sight lines to achieve perfection. What began as a flat expanse soon rose like a sun from the sand. Beneath a sky of bronze, gangs of workers, farmers during the flood season, craftsmen the rest of the year, labored in rhythm to the beat of drums and overseers' calls. They hauled limestone from nearby quarries and granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. Wooden sledges slid over wetted sand, ropes thick as a man's arm groaned under the strain. To coordinate this vast machine of labor required not tyranny, but precision. Teams bore names: the drunkards of Menkaure, the friends of Khufu, carved into the very stones they placed, laughter and sweat mingling beneath the eyes of their divine king. Within this ordered chaos, Egypt discovered the art of logistics, records scratched onto papyrus list bread rations, beer jars, and numbers of oxen. The first glimpses of an organized workforce in human history. The pyramid became a national enterprise, a project of faith as much as engineering. Each worker, whether mason or cook, believed he was building not just for his pharaoh, but for the eternal balance of the cosmos. The pyramid's inner heart was shaped for the king's resurrection. Deep within, a network of corridors and chambers formed a symbolic journey through the underworld. The grand gallery rose steeply toward the burial chamber, its corbelled walls narrowing like a funnel toward the heavens. Above the chamber, 5 granite ceilings distributed the unimaginable weight pressing down from millions of tons of stone. To walk those corridors today is to feel the pressure of centuries, a silence so complete it seems alive. When finished, Khufu's pyramid dominated the horizon. Its gleaming casing stones caught the sun so fiercely that travelers compared it to a pillar of fire. For 40 centuries it remained the tallest structure on Earth, a summit of human ambition unequaled until iron and steel replaced stone. Each block, perfectly aligned, was both a triumph of mathematics and an act of devotion. Together, they formed a single prayer, large enough to be seen from heaven. Around it stretched a city of the dead. Causeways linked mortuary temples where priests performed daily rituals to feed the king's spirit, offering bread, beer, and incense as if eternity required its own harvest. Smaller pyramids rose for queens and courtiers, their walls inscribed with prayers guiding souls toward the stars. Nearby, a guardian watched over the necropolis, the great Sphinx, lion-bodied and human-faced, its gaze fixed eternally eastward toward the rising sun, the symbol of rebirth. For the living, life around the plateau continued with astonishing normality. Excavations have revealed workers' villages, bakeries, breweries, dormitories, proof that these builders were not slaves but citizens fulfilling a sacred duty. In one surviving record, a foreman named Mera describes his daily labor ferrying fine limestone by barge from the quarries of Tura to the construction site. His words are plain, practical, yet through them breathes the hum of the ancient machine. How the Nile itself became a conveyor of dreams. Khufu's successors followed his path. Khafra built his pyramid slightly smaller, but raised it on higher ground, preserving the illusion of supremacy. Menkaure, the third of the Giza kings, wrapped his pyramid in granite, its dark surface meant to glow red under the setting sun. Together, their monuments formed a harmony of proportion and power. The Giza Trinity, visible proof that Egypt had mastered eternity. Yet beneath the splendor ran an undercurrent of unease. The very success of the Pyramid Age sowed its own decline. Later generations saw the burden of such colossal projects, the drain on resources, the growing resentment of the living to serve the dead. By the end of the Old Kingdom, tombs moved underground, hidden in valleys and cliffs. protected from robbers and time. The age of open glory gave way to the age of secrecy. Still, the Great Pyramid endured. Its builders had vanished, their names eroded from stone, yet their creation defied the centuries. Sand drifted against its flanks, dynasties rose and fell, but Khufu's tomb remained unmoved. When Greek travelers arrived 2,000 years later, they would call it the first wonder of the world, the standard by which all others were measured. For Egypt, the pyramid was never merely a building, it was a statement of cosmic order. The four sides faced the cardinal points, the apex aligned with the imperishable stars. The king, buried at its heart, became one with the heavens. Death, geometry, and faith were now bound together in a single form, the pyramid, where mathematics became myth. And yet, even this perfection would inspire restlessness. Across the desert, where the Nile lost itself in the delta and the winds carried whispers of foreign lands, new empires were stirring. Babylon, Nineveh, Persepolis. All would look upon Egypt's legacy and seek to match it with their own visions of grandeur. The ancient race toward eternity was not over. It was only changing hands. The Egyptians had taught the world how to build forever. The next civilizations would learn how to make wonder itself a form of art. When Khufu's pyramid finally cast its perfect shadow across the western sands, Egypt believed it had reached eternity. Nothing grander could be conceived. Nothing stronger could be built. Yet time, as it always does, began its patient rebellion. Winds that once sang hymns to the pharaohs now whispered through broken casing stones. Priests grew old, dynasties changed, and the monuments meant to defy decay became the measure of it. The age of open grandeur was ending, and from its silence emerged something new, an age of secrecy, of hidden chambers and guarded souls. The pyramid had achieved what no monument before it had managed, immortality in plain sight. But to the generations that followed, that very visibility became its flaw. For all its perfection, the Great Pyramid had proven vulnerable, not to the desert, but to men. Robbers slipped through its sealed corridors to plunder the riches buried with the king, stripping away the promise of eternal protection. If the gods could not guard their own house, then wisdom demanded concealment. The next rulers would build not for the eye, but for eternity's shadow. Thus began the slow retreat of Egyptian architecture underground. The great stone mountains of the Old Kingdom gave way to tombs cut deep into cliffs, where the dead could sleep unseen. The shift was more than practical, it was philosophical. The visible had failed. Secrecy would now preserve what splendor could not. Yet even in withdrawal, the Egyptians remained artists of eternity. In these hidden corridors, they replaced the pyramid's blank faces with a new language, painted walls alive with gods, journeys, and stars. The afterlife was no longer represented by mass, but by story. The transition from pyramid to temple was also the story of a changing world. The wealth that had once flowed easily to the pharaohs became contested by nobles, priests, and administrators who ruled provinces like miniature kingdoms. Power, once singular, began to fragment. The old unity of Egypt cracked like weathered limestone, and from its fissures rose a different vision of eternity, one maintained by devotion rather than sheer scale. Temples grew larger even as tombs sank deeper. Across the desert from Giza, a colossal figure lay half buried in sand. The great Sphinx, its lion's body stretched toward the sunrise. Once the guardian of Khafra's pyramid, it had begun to erode into mystery. Later generations restored it again and again. seeing in its inscrutable gaze the permanence their own age had lost. The Sphinx became the bridge between eras, a survivor of the time when kings had believed themselves gods, now watched over by priests who served gods larger than any man. Far to the south, near modern-day Luxor, the architects of the Middle Kingdom experimented with new forms. Their temples rose beside the river, reflecting in its waters like visions of the divine world mirrored in the human. These sanctuaries were no longer tombs, but houses of worship, places where the living could meet the gods face to face. Columns sprouted like papyrus stalks, their carved capitals unfurling toward the sky. Walls, once sheer and silent, blossomed with hieroglyphs that sang of rebirth, power, and cosmic order. The workers who built these new monuments lived in communities whose traces still cling to the cliffs. At Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, an entire village housed the craftsmen who carved the royal tombs. Here, the state provided rations, homes, and families for those who labored to protect the pharaoh's eternal sleep. Their world was one of astonishing intimacy. We know their names, their disputes, even their prayers. On the walls of their homes, they painted miniature gods and household spirits, protectors of children and dreams. Within their stone-cut tombs, they left the same offerings they had carved for kings: bread, beer, and the written word. Each day, they descended into the valley, where death had made its home. The cliffs swallowed them as they entered, lamps flickering against painted ceilings that showed the night sky in perpetual motion. Inside, they carved labyrinths where only the initiated could find their way, a geography of eternity mapped in stone. In these silent corridors, one could almost hear the echo of older dreams. The same belief that had driven Khufu's masons now lived on in smaller, subtler forms. Egypt's devotion to its dead was never merely superstition. It was a form of national memory. Every temple, every tomb was an archive of belief. The Great Pyramid had declared permanence through mass. The tombs of the New Kingdom would achieve it through meaning. The Book of the Dead, painted across walls and papyrus, guided souls through the underworld with spells that blended poetry and geometry. The pharaohs of this later age, Thutmose, Amenhotep, and the heretic Akhenaten, each added to the long conversation between humanity and eternity. But even in decline, the grandeur of the old pyramids never ceased to haunt Egypt's imagination. Pilgrims traveled north to Giza to marvel at the work of their ancestors. The monuments had become relics within their own civilization, objects of wonder, not worship. Scribes etched their names upon the weathered stones, claiming kinship with the builders of old. As men live, one inscription reads, their works endure. When they die, it is their memory that is immortal. In those lines, written more than 1,000 years after Khufu's reign, we glimpse the first stirrings of what later ages would call wonder, the awe of posterity gazing upon the achievements of its ancestors. Economically, the Pyramid Age had been a national enterprise. Scholars estimate that nearly 1/10 of Egypt's resources once fed those great building projects. When that system collapsed, Egypt turned inward, investing in the living faith of its people. Priests, no longer simple servants of the king, became intermediaries between mortals and the divine. Their temples at Karnak and Thebes grew into entire cities of ritual, their walls echoing with hymns that replaced hammer blows. Yet even these sanctuaries, filled with gold and incense, owed their lineage to the pyramids. They were spiritual descendants of the same dream, built with the same precision, animated by the same hunger for permanence. From the upper chambers of Giza to the secret vaults of the Valley of the Kings, Egypt had learned that immortality required both spectacle and silence. The grand geometry of the pyramid had given way to the hidden narrative of the tomb. The visible symbol had become an invisible journey. This evolution was not decline, it was adaptation. Eternity, like empire, changes its language with time. Outside Egypt, other worlds were learning from her example. Traders carried stories of her monuments along caravan routes into Canaan, Mesopotamia, and beyond. The kings of Babylon would one day claim inspiration from the pharaohs, raising temples that reached heaven itself. Across the sea, Greek travelers would later look upon the pyramids and see in them the very definition of wonder, the standard against which human ambition must forever measure itself. In the Egyptian dusk, the Great Pyramid still burned with memory. Its limestone casing had long since been stripped away, its chambers emptied, but its form remained perfect, the equation of man and cosmos unbroken by time. To stand before it, even in ruin, was to stand in the presence of the first human miracle, a creation not born of faith alone, but of faith made visible. For Egypt, eternity had been achieved. Yet the idea it had given to the world, the union of imagination, power, and faith in stone, would travel far beyond its borders. It would cross deserts and empires, inspiring the builders of Babylon, the artists of Ionia, the dreamers of Greece. Each would inherit something of the Nile's geometry, the belief that creation itself could be measured, lifted, and perfected. And so, as the sands of the desert settled over the old kingdom's bones, the idea of wonder did not die. It merely moved eastward, following the path of the rising sun. There, amid the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, another ruler would dream of outshining even Khufu. His city would glitter with blue-glazed gates and towers that touched the sky. His gardens, it was said, hung in the air like paradise itself. The age of the pyramid had passed. The age of the hanging gardens was about to begin. The dream that had risen from the sands of Egypt drifted eastward with the caravans of merchants and the memory of kings. Across the Fertile Crescent, between the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, a new world of power began to shape its own monuments. Empires succeeded one another like tides: Assyria, Babylon, Elam, each claiming to inherit the mantle of the builders who had made the desert bloom with stone. Yet what they sought was not merely eternity, but spectacle. Monuments that could proclaim might as loudly as they defied time. By the 9th century before Christ, the Assyrians ruled from the high citadels of the north. Their capitals, Nimrud, Khorsabad, Nineveh, rose from the plains like walled mountains, fortified cities crowned with temples and palaces. Where Egypt had built for the dead, Assyria built for the living and for fear. Theirs was an empire born in conquest, and its architecture bore the marks of it. City gates towered with winged bulls whose human faces looked outward toward the horizon, silent as gods and twice as pitiless. These colossal guardians, Lamassu, were not idols but warnings. The empire was watching. In the courtyards of Nineveh, sculptors carved scenes of victory in endless reliefs, battles, sieges, and tributes all marching across the palace walls like a stone chronicle of terror. Kings such as Ashurnasirpal and Sennacherib believed that empire required more than armies. It required permanence. They raised terraces of sun-baked brick faced with alabaster panels, their palaces adorned with carved portals taller than any man. The very walls seemed to exhale power. The Assyrians were engineers as much as warriors. Their empire stretched across arid lands where life depended on water, and so they learned to command rivers as they commanded men. Vast networks of canals fed their cities, carrying water from distant mountains. Stone aqueducts, arched like the spine of the earth itself, spanned valleys to sustain their gardens and their people. These were not the delicate oases of Egypt, but deliberate conquests of nature. Among their greatest achievements was the use of the qanat, a network of underground channels that tapped mountain springs and brought water to the plains. Each tunnel, carefully graded by sight and instinct, carried life unseen beneath the desert's surface. In time, this technology would travel westward to Persia and eastward to India, feeding civilizations yet unborn. In Mesopotamia, where the gods themselves were thought to dwell in water, engineering had become an act of worship. Assyria's power was declared in color as well as scale. Their palaces were sheathed in glazed brick, shimmering in blues and golds that caught the sun. When emissaries entered the royal courts, they walked between walls that glittered like the firmament, each tile stamped with the name of the king, as if to remind all who entered that even the light belonged to him. Bronze bands wrapped the cedar gates, engraved with the annals of conquest. What stone recorded in silence, metal repeated in brilliance. Through these centuries of blood and marble, Babylon, older, wiser, and more patient, waited in the south. Once humbled by Assyrian kings, it never forgot its ancient heritage as the city of Hammurabi and the Tower of Babel. Its priests claimed descent from the first builders, its myths stretching back to the dawn when gods had walked the earth. Babylon's revival under Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar would transform the Mesopotamian plain into something that seemed not merely imperial, but divine. While Assyria had built for conquest, Babylon would build for wonder. The new rulers understood that beauty could command obedience as effectively as fear. The great walls of the city stretched for miles, encircling a metropolis of gardens, canals, and palaces. The most famous of its gates, the Ishtar Gate, rose in blue-glazed majesty, its surface alive with dragons, bulls, and lions marching in eternal procession. The walls were faced with lapis-colored tiles that glowed even in shadow, a color chosen not for ornament, but for divinity, the hue of heaven itself. Passing through that gate, travelers found themselves on the processional way, a broad avenue paved with limestone and decorated with lions carved in high relief, each one a symbol of the goddess Ishtar's power. During religious festivals, idols of the gods were carried along this road toward the temple of Marduk, the city's supreme deity. The spectacle was deliberate and overwhelming, music, incense, light, and color mingling into a vision of divine order. The architecture of Babylon was theater as much as theology, but beneath the splendor lay a mastery of craft unmatched in the ancient world. Babylonian builders perfected the art of fired brick, creating materials strong enough to support multi-story structures. They learned to shape vaults and arches with mathematical precision, distributing weight through curvature rather than mass. This innovation would echo through centuries, giving rise to the domes of Persia, the basilicas of Rome, and the cathedrals of Europe. It was also in Babylon that the notion of a city as a living organism found its form. The Euphrates flowed through its heart, divided by quays and bridges that linked its two halves. Along its banks rose terraces planted with date palms and vines, nourished by an intricate system of pumps and channels. To a traveler approaching by river, the city must have seemed like a vision born of myth, its skyline a forest of ziggurats and towers, its air scented with cedar and dust. In the royal palace, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of building paradise on earth. Legends later would claim that he built the hanging gardens for his Median queen, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Whether the story is truth or allegory, it captures the spirit of Babylon's ambition to bring heaven down to earth. to suspend nature itself upon tiers of brick and stone. From the terraces of these gardens, if they indeed existed, water is said to have flowed upward by ingenious means, feeding trees and flowers that bloomed in the middle of the desert. The empire had learned to make even nature serve its will. Beyond their walls, Babylon's influence stretched through trade and tribute. Merchants carried its patterns, its writing, its very sense of proportion to distant lands. The Greeks, centuries later, would adopt the Babylonian number system, dividing the circle into 360 degrees and the day into hours, a mathematical echo of the city's architecture. To measure time itself was another way of building eternity. The legacy of these empires was not only in their ruins, but in their idea of order. In Mesopotamia, power was measured not in the height of monuments, but in their harmony. The ziggurat, once a symbol of devotion, now became the emblem of empire, a mountain of stone layered with meaning, rising from the earth to touch the sky. The Assyrians had used it as fortress, the Babylonians as temple, but to both it represented the axis of creation, the point where heaven and earth met under human design. By the 6th century before Christ, the old empires had begun to crumble. Assyria fell beneath the combined assault of Medes and Babylonians. Nineveh's palaces burned, their carved reliefs buried beneath layers of ash. Babylon itself would soon bow to a new power from the east, Persia, whose kings would take the art of building and turn it into ceremony. But the spirit of the Fertile Crescent endured. From Sumer's first bricks to Nebuchadnezzar's glazed towers, the people of Mesopotamia had proven that architecture could be both tool and theology, weapon and prayer. Across 2,000 years of invention, one thread bound them all: the belief that to build was to rule time itself. Their palaces and temples may now stand in ruin, yet they forged the traditions that would define the next age of marvels. When Greek travelers later wandered among these fallen cities, they saw not the wreckage of forgotten kings, but the foundation of wonder itself. And so, the world turned once more. East of Babylon, in the highlands where the empire's power met the rising dawn, a new dynasty prepared to take the torch. The Persians would inherit the arts of Mesopotamia, fusing its engineering with their own ideals of harmony and grace. Theirs would be an empire of stone and sunlight, of courtyards and colonnades, where ceremony replaced conquest and beauty became the emblem of rule. The builders of Egypt had taught mankind to reach upward. The kings of Babylon had learned to build outward, to turn the city itself into a monument. Now, in the palaces of Persepolis, the world would witness both impulses joined in splendor. The next chapter in the story of the 7 wonders. When Nebuchadnezzar took the throne of Babylon, the city was already old, ancient even to itself. Its ziggurats had long since weathered the winds of conquest. Its canals carried the silt of forgotten centuries. And yet under his reign, it would rise again, brighter and more improbable than ever. The king inherited not just a city, but an idea that the capital of the world must reflect the heavens themselves. From that belief would be born a marvel whose legend would eclipse even its empire: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Babylon stood like a mirage between the rivers, its walls so vast that a chariot could ride along their tops. The city was both fortress and paradise, a deliberate illusion conjured from clay. Through its heart ran the Euphrates, glittering beneath the sun like a vein of gold. Along its banks towered temples, palaces, and processional ways lined with beasts of myth. When travelers approached its gates, they saw walls the color of deep lapis, and above them, terraces of green rising tier upon tier. The desert had given birth to a mountain of gardens. According to later writers, Berossus, Strabo, and Diodorus, the king built these gardens for his queen, Ametis of Media. She had come from a land of hills and forests, and in the flat heat of Mesopotamia, she longed for her native mountains. To ease her homesickness, Nebuchadnezzar ordered his engineers to raise her homeland anew from the dust, a place where trees could grow in the sky and water could climb as if by miracle. It was love turned into engineering. The ancient descriptions, scattered across centuries, read like dreams told secondhand. Some speak of terraces built like giant staircases, supported by columns vast enough to hold forests. Others mention vaulted galleries, cool and shaded, where streams flowed beside marble walkways. Strabo described an irrigation system that lifted water from the river to the uppermost levels, while Diodorus spoke of machines that worked without visible human effort, devices that defied understanding. In every account there is wonder, in none certainty. Babylonian engineers were capable of astonishing feats. They had mastered the arch, the vault, and the fired brick. The very foundations of the city were proof that mud and mathematics could conjure miracles. To raise water against gravity would have demanded genius, yet the age was rich in invention. Some have imagined a chain of buckets driven by cranks. Others, a spiral pump, what later generations would call an Archimedes screw. Whatever the truth, it must have been a marvel of both power and precision. For without such mastery, no tree could have taken root in the air. The question of whether the gardens truly existed has haunted historians ever since. No tablet bears their name, no ruin their plan. Excavations at Babylon have uncovered the remains of temples, palaces, and canals, but not a single trace of the mountain of greenery described by the Greeks. Some scholars have wondered if the gardens were never in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital to the north. There, King Sennacherib boasted of a wonder for all peoples, an engineered paradise fed by aqueducts that spanned the desert. His own inscriptions describe stone conduits, bronze pipes, and artificial hills planted with fruit trees, an image not unlike the legends that later clung to Babylon. Perhaps, as empires fell and stories travelled, the memory of Nineveh's marvel drifted southward, reborn in the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Yet the persistence of the tale suggests more than confusion. It speaks of a deeper truth, the need for every great empire to crown its achievements with beauty. Egypt had raised mountains of stone. Babylon sought to raise life itself. If the Hanging Gardens existed, they were more than architecture. They were a reversal of nature, a statement that human will could make the desert bloom, that even the impossible could be cultivated. Imagine it. The air thick with the scent of cypress and jasmine, terraces shaded by palms and pomegranate, cool streams trickling down from level to level. Birds nested among fig branches that brushed against columns painted blue and gold. From the uppermost platform, the queen could gaze across the city, where the Euphrates coiled like a serpent through the streets, and beyond it, the pale shimmer of the desert she no longer feared. Below, the city bustled, scribes at their tablets, merchants at their stalls, priests ascending the ziggurat of Marduk. Above it all, her mountain of greenery stood against the sky, a living defiance of the dust. In this imagined vision, every element of Babylonian civilization found expression. Water, the sacred source of creation, was not worshipped but commanded. Brick, the humble material of the plain, became the foundation of paradise. Even the organization of labor, thousands of workers, overseers, and engineers, reflected the empire's order. It was beauty achieved through discipline, grace born of mathematics. The Hanging Gardens were said to stand near the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar, close enough that the king could walk among its trees at dusk. From his balcony, he could see the reflection of the gardens in the river below, the green terraces mirrored in gold. To the people of Babylon, the structure was proof that their ruler's power touched both heaven and earth. To visitors from foreign lands, it was a vision that blurred the boundary between reality and myth. When Greek travelers arrived centuries later, they found the city already fading, its gates silent, its ziggurats eroded by time, yet the memory of its marvels endured. Herodotus, who saw only ruins, still wrote of Babylon as a city beyond imagination. Its walls, its temples, its impossible gardens. In the Hellenistic world, where curiosity and nostalgia mingled, these descriptions became scripture. The Hanging Gardens joined the ranks of the 7 wonders, not because they could be found, but because they could not. Their mystery became their monument. The legend endured because it embodied the essence of wonder, creation without comprehension. To the Greeks, the gardens represented the triumph of civilization over chaos, of cultivation over wilderness. To later ages, they became a symbol of lost beauty, a reminder that even paradise can perish. Perhaps they never existed as described. Perhaps they existed only in the imagination of those who longed for them. But imagination, too, builds its monuments. By the time Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon in 539 BC, the city was a shadow of its former self. Its walls still stood, but the power that had raised them was gone. The canals clogged. The terraces, if they had ever stood, crumbled to dust. Yet the name of Babylon would never die. It passed into scripture, into poetry, into the shared memory of humanity, as a synonym for both splendor and sin. In the centuries to come, new empires would claim its inheritance. The Persians would build their palaces of harmony and order, the Greeks their temples of marble and light. But none would forget the dream, born in this city, of clay and water. The dream that beauty could be engineered, that paradise could be built by hand. Whether the Hanging Gardens ever rose above the plains or existed only in legend, they remain one of history's most powerful symbols. They remind us that the greatest wonders are not merely what we see, but what we choose to believe. For thousands of years, travelers have sought their remains among the ruins of Babylon, listening for the whisper of water among the stones. And though the gardens themselves are lost, the idea they gave the world endures, that even in the heart of a desert, humankind can imagine Eden, and for a moment, make it real. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, he found a city that seemed eternal, yet was already living in its afterlife. The Euphrates drifted through silent keys, its waters reflecting towers that had lost their gods. To the conqueror from the highlands of Persia, this was not a ruin to be looted, but a legacy to be inherited. The Persians did not destroy what they conquered. They absorbed it, shaped it, and made it serve a new vision of empire. From the ashes of Mesopotamia rose a dynasty that would fuse the wisdom of all the lands it ruled into a single architectural language, the world's first true art of empire. Cyrus began modestly, as conquerors seldom do. At Pasargadae, his first capital, he built not a fortress, but a garden. The royal city was laid out like a vision of order imposed on wilderness, with canals dividing the land into symmetrical quarters, a pattern that would echo through centuries as the Persian paradise, the garden that gave its name to Eden itself. The palaces of Pasargadae were open to air and light. columns rising like reeds beside pools that mirrored the sky. This was not the architecture of fear, but of harmony, an empire at peace with its own vastness. After Cyrus came Darius, the organizer, the lawgiver, the builder of dreams in stone. It was he who envisioned Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, raised upon a vast terrace carved from the mountain itself. Here, the empires of the world would meet. Tribute bearers from every province, Medes, Egyptians, Indians, Lydians, would ascend its grand stairways bearing gifts. Ivory and lapis, silk and horses, gold and cedar. The walls of the Apadana, the great audience hall, preserved this procession forever in relief, each nation rendered with delicate accuracy. Persepolis was a monument not only to power, but to unity through diversity. To stand upon its platform was to stand at the center of the known world. The terraces spread like a map of empire, northward to the mountains of Media, southward to the sea, eastward to India, westward to Greece. Columns soared 60 feet into the air, crowned by double-headed bulls and lions whose gaze held both vigilance and serenity. The Apadana's vast roof, supported by these forests of stone, seemed to float like the heavens themselves. When the wind moved through it, the sound echoed like distant music. The Persians had inherited the technical genius of the Babylonians and Assyrians, but they gave it grace. Their architects fused the monumental solidity of Mesopotamia with the clarity of Greek proportion and the elegance of Egyptian symbolism. The capitals of their columns borrowed the fluted shafts of Ionia, the lotus forms of the Nile, and the animal guardians of the East. It was as if the entire world had been invited to contribute to the making of its own palace. Beneath the grandeur lay an order as precise as the geometry of the stars. The Persepolis fortification tablets, thousands of clay records discovered in the 20th century, reveal the machinery behind the miracle. Accountants, laborers, stonemasons, scribes, and women administrators, all recorded by name and ration. Here was empire, not as tyranny, but as a network of cooperation. Every province supplied artisans and resources. Every worker, from sculptor to cook, received payment in grain and wine. The building of Persepolis was not the whim of a king. It was the chorus of an empire. When Darius died, his son Xerxes inherited not only the palace, but the vision. Under his rule, Persepolis became the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid realm. Once each year, during the festival of Nowruz, the spring equinox, kings and envoys ascended its stairways to pay homage to the empire's renewal. The marble floors gleamed like still water, reflecting the flames of 1,000 torches. Music, incense, and the murmur of languages from across the known world filled the air. For those who witnessed it, Persepolis must have seemed the very image of eternity, an empire made visible. But the Persians were not content merely to display grandeur. They sought to perfect harmony. Their palaces were designed not to intimidate, but to welcome, built for ceremony rather than defense. The halls opened onto courtyards where water channels whispered through gardens shaded by plane trees. The architecture celebrated balance, the mingling of strength and softness, of stone and air. In this, the Persians revealed something profound. They were the first to understand that beauty could be a form of governance. The walls of Persepolis spoke in silence. Reliefs along the stairways portrayed no scenes of conquest or humiliation, but of tribute offered willingly. Each delegation approached the king with composure and dignity, their garments carved in flowing lines that seemed to ripple with life. The message was clear. In Persia's order, all peoples had their place, and their diversity was not a threat but an ornament. The empire itself was the wonder, its palace the mirror of its soul. Elsewhere, at Susa and Ecbatana, sister cities echoed this splendor. Their halls glowed with glazed brick panels in turquoise and gold, depicting archers, lions, and mythical beasts that symbolized royal power. In Susa's Apadana, the acoustics were so finely judged that a speaker's voice could reach the farthest corner without strain, a feat of sound as deliberate as any feat of stone. It was said that music performed there could be heard as clearly in the colonnades as in the center, the building itself a resonant instrument tuned to ceremony. To walk these palaces at dusk was to feel the pulse of a civilization confident in its destiny. The scent of cedar drifted through the courtyards, mingling with that of roses from the imperial gardens. Attendants moved softly through shadowed corridors, their gold jewelry catching the firelight. From the balconies, one could see the mountains standing guard over the plain, their peaks aflame with the last light of day. The empire seemed endless, and the palaces eternal. Yet within this perfection lay the seed of fragility, for empires, like monuments, are vulnerable not to time, but to change. Beyond the western horizon, the Greek world was stirring, a cluster of small, restless city-states whose curiosity and ambition would one day collide with Persia's order. When Darius sent his armies westward and Xerxes followed, they carried with them not only weapons, but the certainty of civilization's supremacy. The battles that ensued, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, would echo through history as the first tremors of a world shifting on its axis. Still, in the golden decades before that collision, Persia stood unrivaled. No realm had stretched so far, governed so many, or built with such serene confidence. To the Greeks who later beheld its ruins, the palaces of Persepolis seemed both alien and magnificent, a world of luxury and restraint, discipline and dream. They borrowed from it even as they defined themselves against it. The fluted columns of Ionia, the carved capitals of Athens, all bore the faint memory of Persian stone. When Alexander of Macedon finally marched east, he came not only as conqueror, but as pilgrim. In Babylon, he walked among the crumbling terraces, once said to have held the hanging gardens. In Susa and Persepolis, he stood beneath the carved lions of the Apadana, recognizing in them something both foreign and familiar. For the Greeks had inherited the Persians' sense of wonder, the conviction that greatness demanded monument. When at last he ordered Persepolis burned, it was less an act of vengeance than of eclipse, one world giving way to another. The flames consumed the cedar beams, the ivory inlays, the silk hangings. The columns stood long after, blackened but unbroken, as if reluctant to surrender. In their silence, a truth remained. Beauty endures longer than empire. From the ruins of Persepolis, the idea of the world of wonders would pass westward, carried by Alexander's armies and the scribes who followed them. The Greeks would catalogue what they saw, measure it, and name it. They would turn admiration into lists, reverence into study. The 7 wonders of the world were already taking shape, not yet as marble or bronze, but as memory. The Persians had built for harmony, not eternity. Yet in their palaces of sunlight and shadow, they left the world a final lesson, that true grandeur lies not in domination, but in balance. Their columns still stand on the plateau, their bulls still guard the stairways, their gardens still whisper beneath the dust. And from that whisper, the next wonder would rise, a Greek temple of perfect proportion, born of war but built for the gods. As Alexander's conquests brought the world together under one horizon, Greece discovered not just new lands, but a new idea of greatness. His soldiers returned from Asia with tales of Babylon's blue gates, of the shining palaces of Persepolis, of the pyramids that had stood since the dawn of memory. The Greeks, who had long measured beauty by the symmetry of the human form, now turned their gaze to the architecture of the gods. From their astonishment would emerge a tradition unlike any before it, a catalogue of marvels, a map of the human imagination drawn in stone. In the 5th century before Christ, as Athens rebuilt itself after the Persian Wars, the world seemed at once immense and newly knowable. Ships from every shore entered its harbours. Scholars compared notes with travellers who had walked through Egypt and across Asia. For the first time, the boundaries of experience stretched beyond the local and into the universal. The Greeks began to see themselves not as one people among many, but as witnesses to the full breadth of civilization. And in that realization lay the seed of the 7 wonders. The Greek mind sought order in everything: the stars, the body, the state, and wonder itself would be no exception. Herodotus, father of history, had already written of the marvels of Egypt and Babylon. His descriptions of the Great Pyramid, the hanging gardens, and the colossal walls of the East filled his readers with awe, but also with a kind of curiosity unknown to earlier ages. Where older civilizations had built as acts of worship, the Greeks began to admire as acts of thought. To marvel was no longer merely to revere, it was to understand. From this curiosity arose the first lists, informal at first, then formalized through the centuries by poets and scholars. Callimachus of Cyrene, librarian of Alexandria, was among the first to assemble them, though his work survives only in fragments. Later writers, such as Antipater of Sidon and Philo of Byzantium, refined the canon until it settled into the 7 we remember: the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. 7, the sacred number of completeness, of the planets, of the harmony between heaven and earth. To the Greeks, each wonder was more than a building. It was a revelation of what human hands could achieve when guided by genius. They admired not only the scale, but the artistry, the way stone could seem to breathe, or how engineering could imitate nature itself. Their word for wonder, thorma, carried both meanings: a marvel to behold and a thing to ponder. A wonder was not just a monument, it was a question. Travelers and philosophers became the new priests of this expanding faith. They journeyed through the Mediterranean not in pilgrimage, but in pursuit of understanding. Egypt's temples taught geometry and astronomy. Babylon offered lessons in engineering. The East revealed how empire could be expressed through harmony. Every land was a teacher, every ruin a library. When they returned home, they brought not relics, but ideas, the blueprint for what Greece itself would build. Athens, emerging from the scars of invasion, sought to embody this new consciousness in stone. Under Pericles, the Acropolis rose again, crowned by the Parthenon. Built not as a fortress, but as a statement of proportion, it was the visible proof that man could perfect what nature only hinted at. Phidias's statue of Athena gleamed within it, crafted from gold and ivory, her calm gaze surveying the city that had made thought itself a form of worship. The Parthenon was not yet called a wonder, but in spirit it belonged among them. It was Greece's answer to Egypt's pyramids, a temple not to eternity, but to reason. This shift from divine to human admiration marked a turning point in civilization. The earlier empires had built as gestures to gods whose power was infinite. the Greeks built to show what mortals could achieve with intellect and measure. Their temples, theatres, and statues sought perfection through proportion, not magnitude. In that balance between beauty and restraint lay their revolution. Still, the Greek fascination with the foreign remained powerful. The age of Herodotus and Callimachus was also an age of collectors, of thinkers who wished to contain the world within their minds. Alexandria, founded by Alexander and perfected by his successors, became the heart of this intellectual empire. In its library, the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world would ever see, scholars gathered to describe the marvels of creation, both natural and man-made. There, the first lists of wonders took form, transforming admiration into classification. The world had become a museum. Not every monument made the list. The Greeks admired the colossal temples of Egypt, the fortifications of Mesopotamia, the palaces of Persia, but only those that embodied harmony as well as size were chosen. The number 7 was itself symbolic. It reflected the visible planets, the days of the week, the notes of music. To name 7 was to impose cosmic order on chaos. And so the Greeks, with characteristic precision, curated the world's grandeur into a single vision of perfection. The choice of wonders also revealed the boundaries of Greek imagination. Most of them lay within lands known to the Hellenic world, from Egypt to Asia Minor, from Babylon to Rhodes. The Greeks were limited not by curiosity, but by geography. Their sea connected them to everything they could comprehend, and what lay beyond its waters remained myth. The wonders were, in truth, the circumference of their world, the ring of light beyond which lay darkness. Travelers returned with stories that blurred fact and fable. They spoke of statues that shone like suns, of gardens that floated in the air, of tombs so vast that they rivaled mountains. Some of these stories were exaggerations, others misremembered observations of real places. But the Greeks understood something modern minds often forget, that wonder does not depend on certainty. A thing need not be proven to be believed. Belief itself was a kind of architecture. The 7 wonders became a moral as well as a geographical compass. They reminded mankind that greatness was fleeting, that beauty was mortal. Every traveler who visited them remarked not only on their glory, but on their fragility. Earthquakes had already damaged the Mausoleum. The Colossus would one day fall. The lighthouse would crumble into the sea. Only the Great Pyramid would survive them all. Perhaps that was why it always stood first on the list. It was the symbol of endurance against time's relentless tide. In the Greek mind, wonder was both celebration and warning. The same ambition that built the Parthenon could, if unrestrained, destroy what it admired. Thus, the 7 wonders were not only monuments of pride, but lessons in humility. They taught that the pursuit of perfection must always balance awe with understanding. By the late Hellenistic age, the tradition of marvels had become a mirror of the human spirit. The lists changed with the centuries. New wonders replaced the fallen ones. But the impulse remained the same, to preserve what the eye could no longer see, to translate greatness into memory. The Greeks, more than any people before them, understood that to name something as wondrous was to save it from oblivion. And so, as the scrolls of Alexandria multiplied and poets wrote their hymns to distant monuments, the stage was set for the age of marble and myth to bloom in full. The Parthenon had shown what human reason could achieve. Now, across the sea in Asia Minor, a temple to a goddess would rise that would blend devotion with design so perfectly that it would become a wonder in its own right. The The Greeks had learned how to catalogue the extraordinary. Next, they would learn how to build it. Before Athens crowned its heights with marble, before Rhodes raised its bronze giant to the sea, another wonder already stood beside the waters of Ionia. A temple so luminous that even moonlight seemed to bend toward it. Ephesus, resting on the western edge of Asia Minor, was a place where land and sea met in harmony, where pilgrims arrived by ship and left speaking of perfection. To look upon the sanctuary of Artemis was to feel, if only for a moment, that divinity had taken physical form. Ephesus was ancient long before the Greeks gave it a name. In the beginning, it had belonged to older peoples who worshipped a mother goddess of fertility and the moon. When Ionian settlers came, they did not erase that deity, but transformed her. The Great Mother became Artemis, the huntress who ruled both wilderness and birth, protector of the young and the fierce. Her temple would embody her contradictions, wild and measured, feminine and unyielding, a monument to both creation and restraint. At the mouth of the Cayster River, where the marshes shimmered under the sun, the architects Chersiphron of Knossos and his son Metagenes began their work. Their chosen site defied logic, unstable ground where foundations might sink. Yet that softness, they reasoned, would cushion the temple from earthquakes. The earth that threatened to consume it would, in time, preserve it. Marble replaced the mud brick of earlier sanctuaries, gleaming in the Ionian light like captured moonfire. Blocks from Mount Prion were hauled to the plain, along roads slicked with olive oil, dragged by oxen and sweat and prayer. When the foundations were set, columns rose one by one, more than 100 in all, each carved with precision so exact that the spaces between them seemed to breathe. At their full height, 60 feet from base to capital, they formed a forest of stone that caught the sunlight and scattered it like ripples on water. Within that marble grove, the goddess awaited. Her image, ancient and enigmatic, was unlike the graceful Olympians of later art. A black, many-breasted figure covered in symbols of animals and fruit, a living encyclopedia of life itself. To the Greeks she was strange, almost foreign, but they accepted her as she was, a deity older than reason and larger than imagination. Life in Ephesus revolved around her temple. Pilgrims crossed the sea to leave offerings of gold, ivory, and woven cloth. Merchants deposited treasures within its chambers, trusting the sanctity of the goddess more than any lock. The sanctuary became both shrine and bank, its wealth guarded by reverence. Festivals filled the city with music and processions. Torches lit the colonnades at night, their reflections trembling across the marsh pools until the temple seemed to float upon its own light. For 2 centuries, it stood untouched by time. Then, on a night in 356 BC, that harmony was shattered. A man named Herostratus crept into the sanctuary, carrying fire. Whether madness or arrogance drove him, no one could say. But when dawn came, the masterpiece lay in ruins. Cedar beams had collapsed in a storm of flame. The marble had cracked with heat, and the goddess's image was gone. The people of Ephesus executed the arsonist and forbade his name to be spoken. Yet history, ever perverse, remembered it. On that same night, far to the west, Alexander the Great was born, and later ages whispered that the goddess had been too occupied attending his birth to save her own house. Ephesus grieved, but faith in Artemis did not die. Within a generation, the city resolved to rebuild. The new temple would not merely restore the old, but surpass it, a defiance against destruction, a resurrection in marble. Under the direction of Dionysius, work began anew around 350 BC. The foundations were raised higher to escape the floods. the dimensions expanded until the temple stretched 425 feet in length. 127 columns supported its roof, each carved with intricate bases and capitals, some adorned with sculpted figures that seemed to dance in frozen ceremony. Every block was a conversation between precision and grace. The marble shifted from white to rose as the sun moved, giving the building the illusion of breath. Inside, a new statue of the goddess stood beneath a canopy of carved cedar, her face calm, her hands open as if to gather light. Around her burned 1,000 lamps whose flames turned the air to gold. To enter was to pass from the world of men into geometry made divine. The temple was not only a place of worship, but a living symbol of Greek prosperity. Philosophers taught in its courtyards, poets recited their hymns, merchants concluded treaties under its shadow. Even Alexander, victorious and young, offered to finance its completion. The Ephesian priests declined politely, declaring that it was not proper for one god to build a house for another. The temple was a civic statement as much as a sacred one, a monument to the independence of faith and city alike. When the second temple of Artemis was finished, the world had nothing to equal it. Its beauty was mathematical, its grandeur serene. Travelers approached it with reverence that bordered on disbelief. The marble gleamed even under moonlight. From the harbor, it seemed to hover between sky and earth. Antipater of Sidon, who later composed the definitive list of the 7 wonders, placed it first among them. "I have seen the walls of Babylon," he wrote, "and the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus. But when I saw the house of Artemis towering to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brightness, and I said, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on anything so grand. The centuries turned, and empires rose around it. Earthquakes shook the plain, invaders plundered the coast, yet the temple remained. Even when faith in Artemis waned and other gods took her place, the columns still caught the dawn, their shadows stretching across the reeds like memories. Eventually, time claimed what fire had not. The roof collapsed, the stones were quarried, the goddess's image disappeared into legend. Today, a single column stands amid the marsh, built from mismatched fragments, its reflection trembling in the water. Yet even that ruin holds a kind of grace, as though the earth still remembers what once rose there. The temple's grandeur survives in the language of architecture, in every column that seeks proportion and poise. It taught the ancient world that beauty could be sacred, that destruction was never final, and that perfection, once achieved, could echo through centuries of silence. From that marble sanctuary, another wonder would be born. Far to the west, in Olympia, artisans were already preparing to shape divinity once more, not in stone this time, but in gold and ivory. There, beneath the open sky, the Greeks would give their mightiest god a body worthy of thunder. Across the valleys of Elys, where olive trees shimmered in the heat and cicadas sang above the Alpheus River, the sanctuary of Olympia waited in solemn beauty. Each summer, pilgrims arrived from every corner of the Greek world, drawn by the sacred truce that halted wars for the games held in Zeus's honor. Here, competition was prayer and victory, a form of worship. Yet even amid the temples and altars, the Greeks felt something missing, an image worthy of the god whose thunder commanded the heavens. The temple of Zeus stood ready, vast and austere, but its inner space demanded a presence that could unite the divine and the human in a single form. That task fell to Phidias of Athens, already celebrated for the golden Athena of the Parthenon. To him was given a commission not merely to sculpt a statue, but to embody faith itself. Where other craftsmen worked for kings, Phidias labored for eternity. He arrived at Olympia in the middle of the 5th century before Christ and established his workshop beside the temple, a place that still bears his name. The air there would soon fill with the scent of molten gold and the sharp tang of ivory, for he intended to create something the world had never seen, a god whose calm would command more reverence than fear. Zeus had always been imagined as storm and might, yet Phidias conceived him differently. The god would not be caught mid-battle or seated in fury. He would rest upon his throne, serene and omnipotent, the universe's still point. When the artist began his work, he did so with ceremony. He purified himself in the river before entering the workshop each day, as though stepping into a temple rather than a studio. The tools of his trade were treated like sacred objects. Even the apprentices whispered in his presence. The technique he used, chryslephantine, was itself a marvel. A wooden framework formed the statue's body, upon which thin plates of ivory were fitted for flesh and sheets of gold for robes. The ivory required delicate preparation, soaked, polished, and shaped by heat until it glowed with a living translucence. To preserve it from cracking in the summer air, the priests later anointed the surface with olive oil drawn from the sacred grove. Light from bronze lamps flickered across the figure, animating it with a gentle radiance that seemed to breathe. When the work was finished, the sanctuary fell silent. Phidias unveiled the statue before the assembled priests and magistrates, and those who saw it later spoke of a presence that seemed to command the very air. Zeus sat upon a throne of ebony and ivory, its legs adorned with figures of gods and heroes. His right hand held a statue of victory, his left a scepter topped with an eagle. Around him shimmered robes of beaten gold that caught and scattered the torchlight. The god's face was calm, neither smiling nor stern, but filled with that serenity the Greeks called sophrosin, the balance of power restrained by wisdom. To step inside the temple was to enter eternity's chamber. The space was dark, lit only by the lamps and the reflection of their light upon the statue. The ceiling's height amplified the illusion that Zeus was infinite. His head nearly brushed the roof, as if the god might rise at any moment and walk into the world. Pilgrims described trembling before him, yet what they felt was not terror, it was awe touched by peace. As the poet Halicarnassus wrote, "Though it rains upon the roof of other temples, at Olympia it rains only outside, for the god within needs no reminder of his dominion." The temple itself, designed by Liban of Elis, framed the statue like a jewel. Its Doric columns rose in perfect order, and its pediments were carved with scenes of mythic struggle. Pelops and Wenemaeus, the Lapiths and Centaurs, conflicts resolved under the watch of the serene deity inside. The contrast was deliberate, chaos upon the outer walls, harmony within. Phidias had not merely created a sculpture, he had transformed a building into revelation. For nearly 9 centuries, the statue of Zeus reigned as the supreme image of divinity in the Western world. Kings sent offerings. Generals prayed before campaigns. Even the Romans, who plundered Greece with iron and fire, left Olympia untouched for generations. They too felt that to harm the statue would invite punishment from the sky. The god's throne was decorated with inlays of gold and precious stones, but its true treasure lay in its effect upon the human soul. No description, said ancient writers, could convey its majesty. Strabo confessed that seeing it banished all sorrow from his heart. Another visitor claimed that had Zeus himself appeared in flesh, he could not have looked more real. The power of the statue was not in movement, but in stillness. It expressed that perfection which once achieved needs no gesture. Time, however, never rests. Earthquakes shook Olympia, fires scorched its altars, and the games themselves dwindled as Rome turned from Greek gods to its own. The statue survived these changes, but not the empire's conversion. When Christianity rose to dominance, the temple was closed, its sanctity replaced by suspicion. In the 4th century after Christ, the statue was carried to Constantinople, where it adorned the palace of the emperors for a brief and final season. There, around 475 AD, a fire consumed it, and the god of Olympia vanished into ash and legend. Yet his absence was never complete. Fragments of the workshop survive. The molds, the tools, the ivory trimmings turned to powder. More enduring still is the idea that art can capture eternity, that beauty can render power visible without cruelty. The Greeks believed that in Phidias's statue, they had seen not a god made by man, but man remade in the image of a god. When Antipater of Sidon composed his list of wonders, he placed Zeus among them with quiet reverence. "The sun has seen no greater marvel," he wrote, "save the house of Artemis at Ephesus." Between the moonlit temple of the goddess and the golden calm of the god, the Greeks had found their two poles of perfection, feminine grace and masculine order, each reflecting the other like light on water. The sanctuary of Olympia eventually sank beneath centuries of river silt, its columns fallen, its altars gone. Yet the legend of the statue endures. It is there in every portrayal of majesty seated, in every ruler who imagines himself enthroned above his people, and in every museum where marble gods still reign in silence. The calm gaze of Zeus seems to linger, a reminder that greatness need not shout to be eternal. The Greeks had learned to capture the divine in form. Now they would attempt to immortalize themselves in death. South along the Aegean coast, in a city called Halicarnassus, a ruler prepared to build a tomb that would outshine life itself. When the sculptors and builders of Greece looked westward, they saw temples raised to gods. When they turned east, they saw tombs raised to kings. Between these two worlds, at Halicarnassus, on the coast of Caria, a ruler sought to unite both visions in a single act of defiance. His name was Mausoleum. To his subjects he was satrap, to his wife Artemisia, beloved, and to posterity, the man whose tomb would give its name to all monuments of the dead. Halicarnassus stood where the mountains fell into the Aegean, a harbour sheltered by stone ridges and crowned by fortresses. Greek settlers had founded it centuries earlier, but under Persian rule it became a crossroads of civilizations. Caria's rulers spoke Greek, thought like Persians, and built with ambition, borrowed from both. Mausolus inherited a land of blended traditions, and his vision matched it. He dreamed of a capital that could rival the splendor of Athens or Babylon, yet remain uniquely his own. During his reign, the city flourished. Marble quarries at nearby Kindia provided the raw material for his architects. Trade with the eastern provinces filled his coffers with gold. He rebuilt Halicarnassus from its foundations, aligning streets with the precision of an engineer, and crowning its harbour with defensive walls and colonnaded courts. At its centre rose the palace, and near it, on a rise overlooking the sea, he ordered the construction of his tomb. It was to be a monument not of grief, but of grandeur, a declaration that kings could achieve in death the permanence denied them in life. The architects Satyrus and Pythias of Priene designed the structure. They envisioned a building that would blend Greek grace with Eastern majesty, a harmony of column and pyramid, of sculpture and space. The foundation was laid on a rectangular terrace, its sides flanked by marble steps. Upon this base stood a colonnade of 36 Ionic pillars, each supporting a roof crowned by a stepped pyramid. At its summit, a 4-horse chariot, carved from marble, carried the figures of Mausoleum and Artemisia, eternally side by side, gazing toward the horizon. Within, the burial chamber gleamed with precious metals and carved reliefs. Walls of polished stone enclosed the sarcophagus, while above it, friezes depicted scenes of battle and triumph. These were not the labors of anonymous craftsmen, but of the greatest artists of their age. Scopas, who had carved the passions of gods for the temple of Artemis, took charge of the east face. Bryaxis shaped the north, Timotheus the south, and Leocaras the west. Each master worked in his own style, yet all obeyed a single rhythm, the balance between life's motion and death's stillness. The figures along the friezes seemed alive. Horsemen charged into combat, their reins taut. Warriors clashed with an energy that made stone appear to breathe. Around the base, lions crouched as guardians of eternity, while winged victories soared above the columns. The craftsmanship was so intricate that later travelers would claim the sculptures alone were worth the journey across the Aegean. When Mausolus died before its completion, Artemisia vowed to finish the monument in his honor. Her devotion transformed the project into legend. She commanded that construction continue without pause, paying the artisans from her private fortune. Even as grief hollowed her, her resolve deepened. Legends later claimed that she drank her husband's ashes mixed with wine so that he would live within her forever. Whether true or not, the tale reflects the same impulse that shaped the tomb itself, a love that refused mortality. When the mausoleum was finally complete, it rose nearly 150 feet above the sea, visible to every ship approaching the harbor. Sunlight struck its marble surfaces and made them glow like pale flame. Travelers compared it to the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Greece, yet in truth it belonged to neither. The Greek sculptors had given it life, but its spirit was Persian, proud, ceremonial, and serene. The building stood as a dialogue between worlds, a reminder that beauty knows no borders. Pilgrims came to Halicarnassus to marvel at the structure, and poets wrote of its perfection. To them, it seemed less a tomb than a crown upon the city, a visible soul of marble. Antipater of Sidon later wrote of it with reverence. I have seen the walls of lofty Babylon and the Colossus of the sun. Yet when I looked upon the tomb of Mausolus, I knew that the heavens themselves had come down to earth. Over time, Halicarnassus declined. Earthquakes cracked the colonnades, storms wore down the marble chariot, and the sea gnawed at the cliffs below. Yet the mausoleum endured for nearly 17 centuries before nature and conquest conspired to bring it low. In the 15th century, after Christ, the Knights of St. John built a fortress at Bodrum, quarrying its stones from the ancient tomb. Fragments of reliefs, still sharp with life, were set into the castle walls as trophies of a past no longer understood. The chariot at the summit fell and shattered, its horses buried beneath centuries of dust. But the name survived. Wherever rulers built monuments to their own memory, whether in Rome, Constantinople, or Delhi, they called them mausolea, unknowing heirs to the satrap of Caria. His tomb had outlasted his empire, his marriage, even his people's language. It had become an idea that love, ambition, and art could combine to cheat oblivion. The mausoleum of Halicarnassus changed how the world thought about death. Where earlier ages had built tombs as houses for souls, this was a house for memory, a statement that identity could endure beyond decay. It was both farewell and proclamation, a human voice carved into eternity. In its shadow, sculptors learned that mastery lay not in reproducing nature, but in transcending it. The marble seemed to breathe because the artists had given it more than likeness. They had given it rhythm. That rhythm would echo across centuries, inspiring Roman triumphal arches, Renaissance tombs, and every monument raised by those who refused to be forgotten. By the time Alexander's armies reached Halicarnassus, Artemisia was long dead, her tomb a wonder for those who passed through the harbour. Soldiers, merchants, and poets stood beneath its shadow and felt the mingling of love and ambition that had given it birth. It had no rival in grace, no equal in meaning. To the Greeks, it was proof that beauty could ennoble death. To the world, it became a symbol of remembrance. When later travelers listed the seven wonders, the mausoleum stood among them not for its size, but for its soul. It was the only wonder built for love, and though its stones lie scattered, its name still endures, a monument not of empire, but of affection, carved once and remembered forever. South of Korea, across the Aegean, another city would soon lift its gaze to the sun. There, on an island of traders and seafarers, bronze would replace marble, and a new wonder would rise to greet the morning light. Dawn came differently to Rhodes. While other cities woke to shadows, this island began each day in fire. The eastern horizon flared gold across the Aegean, and the sea, caught between light and wind, glittered like a mirror held before the sun. To the people who lived there, Helios was not only a god of the sky, but a neighbor, a force that touched their harbors, warmed their fields, and defined their destiny. When they triumphed over invaders and reclaimed their freedom, the Rhodians vowed to honor the deity who had guarded their island with light. From that vow would rise one of the greatest wonders the world has ever imagined, a god of bronze and sunlight, towering above the sea. The island's glory began with victory. In 305 BC, Demetrius, son of Antigonus of Macedon, besieged Rhodes with a fleet and army unmatched in the Greek world. His engines of war, the city-taker, the great siege tower with iron wheels and battering rams, rolled against the city's walls, shaking them with thunder. Yet the Rhodians held. They fought with cunning and resolve, aided, so they believed, by Helios himself. When Demetrius withdrew after a year of futility, he left behind his abandoned machines of war. The Rhodians melted them down and, from their enemies' steel, forged gratitude into monument. Their chosen sculptor was Chares of Lindos, a pupil of Lysippus, whose art had captured the sinew and balance of gods. Chares envisioned not a mere statue, but a beacon of defiance. Helios standing in victory, his eyes cast toward the rising sun, a torch or spear in his hand. The project would take 12 years, and much of the island's wealth, but it would turn Rhodes from a trading port into a symbol of human daring. Bronze was their chosen medium, for it held both strength and brilliance. The statue's skeleton was an iron frame anchored deep in stone, its outer surface composed of bronze plates riveted together with mathematical precision. As each section was completed, earth was piled around it to support the growing figure. When the statue reached its full height, some 100 feet from base to crown, the earth was cleared away, revealing a god who seemed to step from the soil itself. Accounts of the Colossus vary. Some later claimed it stood astride the harbour, ships passing between its legs. Others believed it stood inland, overlooking the sea from the citadel. Wherever it stood, its effect was unmistakable. The sun god rose with the dawn, his gleaming surface catching the first light of each day and scattering it across the water. From distant ships, the figure appeared alive, its bronze flashing like flame. To those approaching the island, Rhodes seemed protected by the very power that guided their sails. The logistics of construction bordered on miraculous. Chares and his engineers faced challenges no craftsman had met before. How to balance such mass, how to support limbs outstretched, how to prevent bronze from buckling under its own weight. They cast each plate in local furnaces, cooled it in seawater, and hauled it uphill on pulleys and ramps. The joints were filled with iron supports, the gaps sealed with molten lead to withstand heat and corrosion. Every decision was an experiment, every success a revelation. The Colossus was not only a statue, it was a leap in human engineering. For half a century, Helios of Rhodes reigned as the pride of the Aegean. At sunset, when the sea blazed crimson, his figure darkened into silhouette, a reminder that even the day itself bowed to him. Poets described him as the second sun, a gift of mortals to their divine protector. Pilgrims and travelers arrived from across the Mediterranean to stand before the bronze giant, marveling not only at its size, but at the audacity of those who had dared to build it. Yet like all wonders, it was destined to meet its twilight. In 226 BC, an earthquake struck the island, shaking walls and breaking harbors. The statue, rigid and immense, could not yield to the earth's motion. Its knees buckled, and it fell with a roar that echoed across the sea. When the dust cleared, the Colossus lay shattered upon the ground, its limbs sprawling across the cliffs like the remains of a fallen titan. The Rhodians consulted the oracle at Delphi, hoping to rebuild, but the prophecy forbade it. "Do not restore what the gods themselves have cast down," came the answer. They obeyed, leaving the broken god where he had fallen. For nearly 900 years, the fragments remained. Travelers described them with awe. Fingers larger than men, a face the height of a house, bronze plates that glowed red beneath the sun. Even in ruin, the Colossus commanded reverence. When Arab traders finally carried away its remains in the 7th century after Christ, loading the fragments onto hundreds of camels, they did so not in triumph, but in wonder. They marveled that human hands had once shaped such a thing. The god of the sun had returned to the earth, yet his legend continued to shine. The Colossus of Rhodes was more than an image of Helios. It was the symbol of an age that had learned to think on a cosmic scale. Its builders no longer sought merely to please the gods. They sought to rival them. Bronze had become the language of ambition, sunlight the currency of glory. The statue's brief life revealed both the genius and the fragility of human achievement. Centuries later, when the Romans raised colossal emperors in marble, and the Renaissance revived the art of monument, the memory of Rhodes guided their vision. The word Colossus itself entered every language, no longer meaning only the sun god, but any creation that dared the limits of possibility. Its fall became part of its meaning, a reminder that grandeur, however fleeting, leaves a longer shadow than modesty. To the ancient Greeks, the Colossus stood for unity and defiance. To those who came after, it symbolized the audacity of imagination. Even broken, it illuminated what all the 7 wonders shared: the belief that human hands could shape the divine. In time, the sea that had reflected its brilliance would cradle another monument of light. Across the waters in Egypt, engineers were preparing to raise a tower whose flame would guide ships by night and dazzle the world by day. The god of the sun had fallen, but his fire was about to be reborn in glass and stone. At the edge of the known world, where the Nile met the sea, the city of Alexandria rose like a promise of light. Founded by Alexander and perfected by his heirs, it was the meeting place of continents, a harbour where the ships of Greece, Egypt, and the East came to trade, to learn, and to dream. Its streets ran in perfect lines. Its libraries overflowed with scrolls. Its scholars mapped the stars and measured the earth. Yet above all these triumphs of mind and empire, one monument would define its horizon, a tower of marble and fire that turned night into day. They called it the Pharos, after the small island on which it stood, guarding the mouth of Alexandria's great harbour. It was not a temple, nor a palace, nor a tomb, but something new. A wonder built not for worship or memory, but for guidance. From its summit, sailors could see a flame burning across the Mediterranean, a light that promised safety and home. In an age when most of the world's wonders looked inward, the lighthouse looked outward. Its brilliance offered freely to every traveller who entered the city's embrace. The project was conceived under Ptolemy I and completed by his son Ptolemy II, rulers who understood that power could be expressed through knowledge as well as conquest. Alexandria, their creation, was a living map of Hellenistic ambition. Greek reason merged with Egyptian permanence, intellect bound to empire. To crown it, they commissioned the engineer Sostratus of Cnidus to design a tower worthy of both sea and sky. Sostratus's vision was as daring as anything since the pyramids. The lighthouse rose in 3 stages: a square base of white limestone, a cylindrical tower above it, and crowning all, a smaller structure topped by a statue, perhaps of Zeus, perhaps of Poseidon, holding a torch that mirrored the fire within. From base to flame, the structure reached nearly 400 feet, the tallest building on Earth save the pyramids themselves. By day, its polished stone reflected the sun. By night, its mirrors caught the fire from the great furnace and threw it across the waves for miles. The secret of its brilliance lay in the mirror, a curved surface of bronze tilted with careful precision. Scholars still debate how far its light could reach. Ancient sailors swore they saw it 40 miles from shore. Others claimed its beam was so fierce it could burn the sails of enemy ships. Whether or not the stories are true, the effect was the same. A city that had captured light itself, domesticated it, and set it to work for man. Sostratus left his mark on the monument with quiet cunning. According to legend, the dedicatory inscription originally praised King Ptolemy, but beneath the plaster lay the engineer's true message carved into the stone. Sostratus of Cnidus, to the saviour gods, for the benefit of those who sail the sea. In time, the plaster wore away, revealing his words. The engineer had built not for kings, but for all who journeyed under the stars. To the people of Alexandria, the Pharos was more than a lighthouse. It was the city's soul made visible. From its galleries, observers could watch the endless motion of the harbour, triremes gliding through the channel, merchants unloading amphorae of wine and oil, fishermen casting nets in the glittering shallows. At night, the flame's reflection shimmered across the water like a path laid for the gods. The tower was the axis of a world newly aware of its own brilliance, a bridge between the earthly and the eternal. The lighthouse also became the first true monument of science. Its keepers, trained in mathematics and optics, tended the mirrors with ritual precision. They understood that the geometry of reflection was not magic, but method, that light obeyed laws as constant as the heavens. From their work came the study of perspective and the earliest theories of vision. The Pharos, born of empire, became a temple to reason itself. Travellers approaching Alexandria wrote of their astonishment. From the sea, the city seemed to float on light, its harbour mouth marked by twin breakers curving like open arms. As the sun set, the beacon ignited, and the entire horizon glowed. For sailors who had spent months in darkness, that single flame was both signal and salvation. To glimpse it was to know that knowledge, not faith, could command the elements. The Pharos endured for more than 15 centuries, surviving storms, invasions, and dynasties. Earthquakes struck the region again and again, each time shaking the tower but never destroying it. Even the Romans, who inherited Alexandria's splendor, kept the lighthouse burning, understanding that it symbolized the empire's dominion over both nature and night. Only in the 14th century, when the earth itself convulsed in a series of great shocks, did the Pharos finally collapse into the sea. Its stones were later used to build the Kite Bay citadel, which still guards the same harbor, a fortress where once a flame had stood. For the ancient world, the lighthouse represented something greater than safety. It was proof that human reason could master the environment without arrogance, that knowledge could serve mercy as well as power. Unlike the pyramids, it was not built to preserve a single soul, nor like the statues of gods to demand worship. Its purpose was to guide and protect, to turn invention into compassion. In that sense, the Pharos was the most humane of all the wonders, the one that gave rather than glorified. Even in ruin, its influence survived. Every beacon built thereafter carried its memory. Every harbor tower that guided ships through darkness was its descendant. The very word Pharos came to mean lighthouse in a dozen tongues. It had outlived its empire and its builders, becoming a symbol of what civilization could offer to the world, a light against uncertainty. As the centuries turned and the flame of the Pharos faded into legend, the Greek world that had imagined it began to dim as well. The torch of empire passed westward to Rome, while scholars in Alexandria gathered the fragments of knowledge that would survive the coming storms. Yet in their hearts they kept faith with light, the eternal metaphor that bound gods and men. The sea around the Pharos still glows at sunset, the water shifting from blue to gold before surrendering to night. Beneath those waves lie the fallen stones of the lighthouse, scattered but unforgotten. Divers who descend there today say the light is different in those depths, as if it remembers the flame that once ruled the horizon. And as that light sinks into legend, the world of Greece and Egypt yields to a new order, the age of catalogues and scholars, of poets who would fix the 7 wonders forever in memory. The Greeks had built their marvels, now they would name them, giving shape to wonder itself. By the time the last light of the Pharos swept across the sea, the ancient world had already begun to turn inward, to measure itself, to preserve what it could of greatness before time eroded it. Greece's age of conquest had ended, but its age of remembrance had begun. Across the Mediterranean, travelers, scholars, and poets now sought not to build wonders, but to name them, to capture the memory of marvels in words, to transform the fleeting into the eternal. Alexandria, city of light and learning, became the heart of this new pursuit. Within its great library, where hundreds of thousands of scrolls whispered with the knowledge of every land, men devoted their lives to ordering the vast inheritance of civilization. Maps of the known world hung beside star charts and architectural plans. Shelves groaned under the weight of Homer and Herodotus, of geometry and myth. In that atmosphere of endless curiosity, the idea of cataloguing wonder itself took form. The first lists were fluid, personal, and poetic, travelers' tallies of what astonished them most. Some included Babylon's walls, others the palace at Susa, others yet the marble temples of Greece. But as scholars debated and poets refined, a consensus began to crystallize. 7 became the sacred number, not too few for grandeur, not too many for memory. 7 planets, 7 strings of the lyre, 7 gates of Thebes. The pattern seemed to echo the harmony of the cosmos. In enumerating the world's marvels, the Greeks believed they were reflecting its divine order. Callimachus of Cyrene, curator of the library, is said to have written the earliest known compilation, a catalogue of marvels across the earth, though only fragments survive. Later came Antipater of Sidon, whose verses gave the list its immortal form. He spoke not as historian, but as pilgrim, guiding readers through a landscape of astonishment. "I have set eyes on the walls of Babylon," he wrote, "and the Zeus by the Alpheus, and the hanging gardens, and the sun's Colossus, and the massive labour of the high pyramids, and the vast tomb of Mausoleum. But when I saw the house of Artemis towering to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brightness. Through his poetry, admiration became canon. Others refined the catalogue further. Philo of Byzantium, writing not in verse but in analysis, described the engineering behind each wonder, how the pyramids stood, how the gardens hung, how the pharaohs shone. His was a scientist's awe, precise and reverent. By his time, the 7 wonders had become more than places. They had become ideas, each symbolizing a facet of human aspiration. Egypt embodied endurance, Babylon, imagination, Greece, proportion, Persia, harmony. The list was a mirror of civilization itself. The wonders, though scattered across empires, were united by something deeper than geography. All stood within the reach of Greek travel, bounded by the Mediterranean and the Near East, the circle of the known world. Beyond that horizon lay lands of rumour and myth, but the Greeks did not need the unknown to find astonishment. To them, wonder was not at the edges of the map. It was in the perfection of what men could already see. In the halls of Alexandria, scholars debated what qualified a marvel. Was it size, or beauty, or the skill it required? Some argued that only what was man-made could count. Others included the natural world, the Nile, the moon, the stars. But as the lists evolved, one truth emerged. A wonder was not merely a thing seen, but an encounter between creation and comprehension. It was the moment when human craft touched the divine, and the mind trembled at its own reflection. Merchants returning from distant ports carried these stories like relics. They described the golden statue of Zeus, whose gaze seemed to follow the sun, the temple at Ephesus glowing like frost beneath the moon, the gardens that rose above Babylon's dust. Their words spread through markets and taverns, through ships' holds and academies. Wonder became a kind of currency, traded from tongue to tongue, enriching all who spoke of it. Still, there was melancholy within this cataloguing of greatness. By the time Antipater composed his verses, some of the wonders already lay in ruin. The Colossus had fallen, its bronze scattered. The temple of Artemis had burned and been rebuilt. The gardens, if they ever truly existed, were legend fading into air. The act of naming them was also an act of mourning, a way to keep them alive, as the world that had built them began to fade. The 7 wonders became both celebration and elegy. They marked the pinnacle of human creativity and the inevitability of its decline. The Greeks, more than any people before them, understood that beauty and impermanence were twins. To name something as wondrous was to admit that it would one day be lost. Still, the lists endured. Scribes copied them onto papyrus. Poets recited them to crowds eager to imagine what they would never see. The wonders passed into education and myth, until even children could recite them as easily as the names of the gods. Each generation repeated the list with slight variations, yet always with the same reverence, as if the mere act of speaking them kept civilization from forgetting itself. In time, the 7 wonders came to represent more than monuments. They defined what it meant to be human. The Greeks had built temples for gods, but in naming the wonders, they built a temple of memory for mankind. Their lists crossed borders, survived empires, and became part of the universal language of admiration. By the late Hellenistic age, poets of Alexandria spoke of the world itself as a wonder, a work of divine architecture whose patterns echoed those of the monuments they praised. Astronomers in the Museum compared the Pharos to a star. Sculptors modeled new works upon Phidias's Zeus. Even as the monuments crumbled, their ideas multiplied, inspiring imitation and reinvention. But the Hellenistic world, for all its learning, could not escape the slow decline that claims every civilization. Earthquakes tore through Asia Minor. Wars spread across the Aegean. Empires rose and fell as easily as waves against the shore. The lists remained, floating above ruin like constellations over a darkened earth. To the poets of Alexandria, that endurance became its own kind of miracle. The 7 wonders no longer belong to nations or kings. They belong to history itself, to the endless conversation between what is made and what is remembered. And so, in the final centuries before Rome's ascendancy, the Greek world turned its gaze backward. The builders had vanished. Their monuments had begun to fall. Yet the idea of wonder remained, indestructible. The age of creation had passed. The age of preservation had begun. From the ruins of Ephesus, Olympia, and Halicarnassus, travelers carried fragments home, shards of marble, bits of bronze, lines of poetry. Together they formed a mosaic of remembrance. Through these fragments, humanity had discovered a new kind of immortality, not in stone, but in story. The world that had built the wonders was fading, but their echoes endured, an inheritance waiting for those who would rediscover them in centuries yet to come. The age of marvels had burned brightly, but no fire endures forever. As centuries passed, the world that had raised the 7 wonders began to crumble beneath the weight of its own glory. Earth shifted, empires fractured, and the gods themselves grew silent. One by one, the monuments that had defined human ambition fell to forces more patient than armies: time, neglect, and the indifferent will of nature. At first, the decline came quietly. The Greeks who had celebrated the wonders now lived under Roman rule, their cities provincial echoes of former greatness. Marble temples became quarries for new foundations. Bronze statues melted to coin. Yet even as the physical world decayed, the idea of wonder refused to die. Poets still recited Antipater's verses, and travelers carried his list as if it were scripture, a map of vanished perfection. In the east, the pyramids endured longest. They had already stood for 2,000 years when the first wonder lists were written, and they would outlive them all. Sand buried the causeways and temples that once surrounded them, but the Great Pyramid remained, its summit shorn, yet its core unbroken. Roman generals rode past it and claimed to have measured its height. Christian monks later prayed in its shadow. Empires changed, the stones did not. It was the last voice of the ancient world that could still be heard. Farther north, the temple of Artemis had fallen again. Earthquakes shook the plain of Ephesus, and invaders carried off its marble for fortresses and churches. By the time St. John preached nearby, only fragments of column and carved relief lay among the reeds. Pilgrims came not to worship the goddess, but to marvel at what faith and flame had destroyed. The sanctuary once called the House of the Gods became a quarry for the living, and a caution for the devout. In Olympia, the statue of Zeus met a quieter end. The temple's roof collapsed under storms. The gold and ivory figure was carried to Constantinople, where it gleamed in the palace of the emperors until a fire consumed it around 475 AD. The ashes of Phidias's masterpiece mingled with the dust of empire. Yet for centuries after, pilgrims still spoke of its serenity, imagining the god's calm face whenever thunder rolled across the sky. Halicarnassus, too, fell to ruin. Earthquakes shattered the mausoleum's columns, and by the Middle Ages, its marble blocks were repurposed for the walls of Bodrum's fortress. The chariot and statues that once crowned it disappeared into legend. Only its name survived, reborn in every grand tomb thereafter. A strange immortality, to vanish yet remain in language. Rhodes lost its bronze guardian sooner still. The Colossus lay broken on its cliffs, the limbs too heavy for men to move. When later travelers saw its scattered pieces, they mistook ruin for myth, as though a giant had once walked among them. The oracle's warning, "Do not rebuild what the gods have cast down," was obeyed so faithfully that centuries passed before anyone dared raise such a statue again. Babylon's fate was the most complete of all. Conquered by Persians, neglected by Greeks, forgotten by Romans, it became a wilderness of dust. The Hanging Gardens, if they had ever truly existed, vanished without a trace. Only the Euphrates remembered where they had stood, flowing past mounds of brick and broken walls. Travelers later mistook these ruins for the Tower of Babel, unable to believe that such emptiness could once have held paradise. The Lighthouse of Alexandria survived the longest of the later wonders. Its flame burned through invasions and dynasties, guiding ships long after the Ptolemies were dust. Even the Romans admired it, and when Christianity came, they kept the beacon alight, calling it a marvel of God's creation rather than the work of pagan kings. Only nature could end what men revered. In 956, then again, in 1303, earthquakes struck the delta. The last tremor sent the tower crashing into the sea, where its stones still lie scattered like fallen stars. By the 5th century after Christ, the Age of Wonders had ended. The old religions faded. The temples closed. The world's attention turned from the gods to the one God, and the monuments of polytheism became curiosities, warnings rather than inspirations. Yet memory persisted. Christian pilgrims visiting Egypt still marveled at the pyramids, unable to reconcile their scale with the new order of faith. These, one monk wrote, are the works of men who knew the vanity of the flesh and yet sought to make it eternal. As the Roman Empire withered, the physical ruins of the ancient world were repurposed or forgotten, but their echoes survived in scripture, myth, and art. The Great Pyramid was folded into biblical geography, its builders recast as tyrants in Hebrew story. The lost gardens of Babylon became symbols of human arrogance. The Tower of the Pharos merged with tales of impossible fire. Even ruin had its uses. It taught humility, a reminder that all human ambition ends in dust. Yet the ancient sense of awe never entirely vanished. Travelers from Byzantium and the early Islamic world recorded the remains they encountered. Columns half buried in sand, statues whose faces eroded into ghostly masks. Scholars such as al-Masudi and al-Idrisi preserved these memories in their chronicles, describing the pyramids and the lighthouse with the reverence of those who saw in them not idolatry, but mastery. Through their pens, the torch of wonder passed quietly into the next civilization. For the Greeks, to name the 7 wonders had been to impose order upon chaos. For later ages, to rediscover them was to remember what order looked like. Each ruin became a meditation on transience, each fallen stone a sermon on time's dominion. The very destruction of the wonders gave them a second life, as metaphors for the fragility of greatness and the endurance of memory. In Rome's final centuries, travelers wrote of the old marvels as if describing a vanished golden age. "Nothing endures," lamented a poet of the late empire, "save the stories men tell." And he was right. The wonders had been built of stone, bronze, and marble, but their true material was imagination. That alone survived conquest, fire, and faith. By the dawn of the Middle Ages, only one of the seven still stood, the Great Pyramid of Giza, solitary against the desert sky. Pilgrims gazed upon it as they had for 4 millennia, astonished that anything made by man could appear older than the world itself. Around it lay the graves of the forgotten. Above it, the stars kept their ancient course. The pyramid had become the monument to all monuments, the last survivor of humanity's first dreams. Yet the others, though gone, lived on in words. Their names became symbols: Artemis for beauty, Zeus for majesty, Mausoleum for love, Helios for courage, Sostratus's Pharos for knowledge, Babylon for imagination. Together they formed a constellation of memory, a map of what mankind had once dared. When later generations began to rebuild the world, they would look back to these ruins for guidance. Every cathedral, every monument, every city of learning owed something to their example, for the ancients had proven a truth no destruction could erase, that to build, to imagine, to wonder, these are the only ways mortals approach eternity. And though their stones lay scattered, the light of their achievements still lingered on the horizon, waiting to be rediscovered. The world that had built the 7 wonders was gone. Its empires lay in fragments, its languages scattered, its gods forgotten. Yet in the silence that followed, the echoes of its greatness refused to fade. Across the ruins of the Mediterranean, travelers, monks, and wanderers walked through dust that still shimmered faintly with memory. The stones of temples and tombs no longer sang, but they whispered. And in that whisper, civilization rediscovered its own voice. In Alexandria, the last scholars of the ancient world labored by candlelight as their libraries burned around them. They copied what scrolls they could, preserving fragments of texts that spoke of monuments no one alive had ever seen. Philo's accounts of the 7 wonders survived in scraps. Antipater's verses were repeated by memory in monasteries far from the sea. Even as the knowledge of how these wonders were built vanished, the desire to remember them deepened. Memory itself became an act of resistance against oblivion. Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century after Christ, described the ancient marvels with reverence and confusion, half recalling, half inventing. To him, they were relics of a world that had lost its faith in one god, but gained it in beauty. The walls of Babylon, the temple of Artemis, the great statue at Olympia. He wrote of them as if they still stood somewhere just beyond the horizon, waiting to be found by the worthy. In his words, wonder became a kind of pilgrimage. Farther east, in the caliphates of the early Islamic world, scholars took up the same inheritance. Al-Masudi spoke of the pyramids as the tombs of kings who sought to ascend to heaven. Al-Idrisi described the ruins of the pharaohs, noting its surviving base and the fragments of the mirror that once caught the sun. They did not worship these remnants, but they studied them, measuring, recording, preserving. The curiosity that had once defined Greece now found a new home in Arabic script and Persian ink. The great monuments had become teachers again. To the chroniclers of the early Middle Ages, they revealed the impermanence of empire and the endurance of craft. A monk might look upon a broken column at Ephesus and see a warning against pride. An astronomer in Cairo might study the angles of the Great Pyramid and find the mathematics of the cosmos hidden in its sides. The gods were gone, but the geometry remained. In time, legend grew around the ruins. The fallen statue of Zeus was said to have been seen walking at night. The Colossus of Rhodes became a giant who guarded sailors from storms. The Mausoleum turned into a palace beneath the sea. The hanging gardens transformed into the paradise promised in heaven. The wonders were no longer monuments. They were myths, transfigured by imagination into moral and spiritual symbols. Where fact ended, reverence began. Yet the earth itself remembered them. At Giza, the Great Pyramid stood unbroken, its shadow stretching over dynasties and faiths alike. When the early travelers of Byzantium saw it, they could not believe it was the work of men. Some said it was a monument built before the flood. Others, a prophecy in stone. Each age gave it new meaning, and in doing so, kept it alive. In Europe, centuries of silence followed. Knowledge dimmed, the language of antiquity grew remote. But even in isolation, the idea of the seven wonders endured. Monastic scribes copied the old lists again and again, sometimes changing their order or adding new marvels. Rome's Colosseum, Jerusalem's temple, Constantinople's walls, but always keeping the sacred number 7. The list became a bridge between the ancient and the medieval mind, a reminder that beauty and faith were not enemies but kin. By the time of the Crusades, travelers once more reached the lands of the old empires. They found deserts littered with columns, harbors where no beacon burned, and temples buried beneath centuries of dust. To them, it was as if time itself had turned archaeologist, revealing the bones of the past. Pilgrims walked among the ruins and spoke of them with awe, their voices carrying across the centuries the same astonishment that had once moved Antipater to poetry. And so the cycle of wonder began anew. Each rediscovery, each fallen stone touched, each inscription deciphered, breathed life back into the ancient world. What the Greeks had named, the medieval scholars reimagined. What the ancients had built, the moderns would seek to understand. The wonders had survived not through their stones, but through the imagination of those who refused to let them die. In the Renaissance, that imagination would awaken fully. Artists studying proportion and symmetry looked back to the lost marvels as models of divine geometry. Architects read of the Mausoleum and dreamed of domes. Sailors, guided by new beacons, called their towers pharaohs in homage to Alexandria. Even the language of admiration returned to its source. Colossal, mausoleum, pyramidal. Each a word carved from the ruins of antiquity. The 7 wonders had become more than a list. They had become a mirror in which every age saw itself. For the ancients, they were proof of divine favor. For the Greeks, expressions of reason and art. For the medieval world, warnings against vanity. For the modern, lessons in endurance. Each era rebuilt them in thought, if not in stone. Today, only the Great Pyramid still stands in the desert light, as it did when Khufu's masons first raised its gleaming sides toward the sky. It has watched every wonder come and go, every empire rise and fall. Around it, sand drifts like memory, covering and uncovering fragments of the past. Yet the story of the 7 wonders endures, passed from scribe to scholar, from poet to traveler, from ruin to imagination. What began as monuments of pride became monuments of memory. Their stones taught humility. Their legends taught faith in the human capacity to dream. Each ruin, each vanished column reminds us that the measure of civilization is not what survives, but what it inspires. And though their flames have long been extinguished, their light remains, woven into our words, our architecture, our art. The wonders may have fallen, but their echo continues, carried through time like the lingering warmth of a sunset long after the sun itself has set. They were built for gods, for kings, for eternity. Yet in their ruins, they belong to us all.